Politics Naturalized, David Hume. Part 3. Contract, Resistance. So it comes to this. Hume's objection to an original contract is not an objection to some distant prehistorical event, but to the claim that the existent political order requires to be founded upon a current or continuing contract, without which it cannot be justified. The original contract of interest to philosophers cannot be the prehistoric agreement which started governments and business, for such a contract, even if it were less limited and more substantial than it possibly could have been, cannot be held to have any purchase on men now living. Hume asks those philosophers who espouse contract as the basis of political obligation to see if they can discover any historical instance where a current contractual agreement between government and subject is to be found. On the contrary, he believes, everywhere we find princes who claim their right to sovereignty either from conquest or from succession. We find subjects who acknowledge this right of sovereignty and believe themselves born with an obligation to obey their princes. How, in fact, did our present governments come to exist, if not by contract? Hume's answer to this question is refreshingly matter-of-fact. He says, almost all the governments which exist at present, or of which there remains any record in story, have been founded originally either on usurpation or conquest or both, without any pretence of a fair consent or voluntary subjection of the people. Where in all this force and violence is there mutual agreement or voluntary association or contract to be found? Suppose, on the contrary, that our government is founded upon some kind of election. How much better would things be? Here too, Hume finds the process less than appealing, for the result of an election is merely that we end up with a few men who decide for everyone and will brook no opposition. And how much better is that than the rule of an hereditary monarch? Is Hume a democrat? Well, no. He writes, in reality, there is not a more terrible event than total dissolution of government, which gives liberty to the multitude and makes the determination or choice of a new establishment depend upon a number which nearly approaches to that of the body of the people. But, it might be objected, did we not have the glorious revolution of 1688 in which the tyrant James II was replaced by William and Mary? Think again, says Hume. That change in the royal succession was determined by a tiny number, some 700 out of a total population of some 10 million. What say did the other 9,999,300 have in this process? None. They acquiesced in the change, but they did not choose to bring it about. If men were so constituted as naturally to be able to refrain from interfering in other men's properties, then government would not have been necessary. If men were so constituted that they knew their own interests, then government could be founded upon consent. But men are not so constituted, and so far from it being the case that they are consulted in the constitution of a government when there is none, it is rather the case that during the fury of revolutions, conquests and public convulsions, military force or political craft usually decides the controversy. Contractarians often argue that even if there is no actual explicit consent to government, still a tacit consent can be deduced from the citizens continuing to reside in the area under the government's rule. But, Hume points out, such a tacit or implied consent could only be plausible if the citizens thought they had a real choice in the matter. But where a man thinks, as all mankind do who are born under established governments, that by his birth he owes allegiance to a certain prince or a certain form of government, it would be absurd to infer a consent or choice, which he expressly, in this case, renounces and disclaims. Your average citizen has effectively little or no choice over continued residence in his home place, any more than the man, by remaining in a vessel, freely consents to the dominion of the master, though he was carried on board while asleep and must leap into the ocean and perish the moment he leaves her. If it were ever the case, as it manifestly isn't, that one generation of men passed away to be succeeded instantaneously and completely by another, then perhaps a case might be made for voluntary consent. But the generations are inextricably intermingled, so that there can be no stability in government unless those born into a given political order conform themselves to the established constitution, whatever that may be. In the end, in response to the question, why are we bound to obey the government, Hume reaffirms the point he made in the treatise, that without such obedience, society could not continue to subsist. Men acquiesce in government not because of any contract, but because they believe that it provides them with security and protection. Hume opens his 1741 essay on the first principle of government with a statement whose truth is hard to resist. He writes, "Nothing appears more surprising to those who consider human affairs with a philosophical eye than the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers." Clearly, the many are stronger than the few, so that the few can ultimately depend not on the superior force, but on what Hume calls opinion. He writes, "It is therefore on opinion that government is founded, and this maxim extends to the most despotic and most military governments, as well as to the most free and most popular." Hume distinguishes several varieties of opinion, but the most pertinent is that the generality of the people must believe that government as a whole is advantageous to them, and that this is true of the particular government in power. Those who govern are men like those they govern, and are subject to the same limitations of perspective. Our governors do not immediately become of a superior nature to the rest of mankind, upon account of their superior power and authority. In fact, given the constancy of human nature, our governors will neglect even this immediate interest, that is, the preservation of order and the execution of justice, and be transported by their passions into all the excesses of cruelty and ambition, writes Locke. In an essay published posthumously, a year after his death, entitled Of the Origin of Government, Hume returned to consider the question he had first discussed in his treatise some 36 years earlier. What, if anything, of his views had he changed? As it turns out, very little. Society cannot subsist without peace and order, and peace and order requires the establishment and maintenance of justice. Every man prefers himself and his own interests over those of others, so that if disorder is to be averted, someone must be assigned the task of ensuring that man's narrow and selfish interests do not disturb the peace and order required for the survival of society. Magistrates, then, are instituted to punish transgressors, to correct fraud and violence, and to oblige men, however reluctant, to consult their own real and permanent interests. In this essay, Hume does add something he had not considered before. It might be objected that our duty of obedience to our rulers is a weak reed that cannot survive the turbulence of our passions. Why should a bad neighbour not be an equally bad citizen? Men love dominion over others, so that those who are chosen to fulfil the role of magistrate do so despite all the dangers and fatigues and cares of government. Hume argues that those first chosen for those roles must, of necessity, have had some outstanding personal merit, whether of courage or wisdom, and those who succeed them, even if they have not the same level of merit as their predecessors, will be obeyed by virtue of habit. He writes, "Men, once accustomed to obedience, never think of departing from that path, in which they and their ancestors have constantly trod, and to which they are confined by so many urgent and visible motives." When our governors become tyrants, then they may be resisted. We owe them no passive obedience. The doctrine of passive obedience amounts to the claim that it is never lawful for a people to resist the authority of the ruler or his agents. As we've seen, this doctrine is often taken to be implied by the Christian scriptures, in particular by Romans 13. In fact, Hume goes so far as to call the doctrine of passive obedience an absurdity. though he does hold that resistance to our governors is limited to the case of extremity, and in normal circumstances, Hume says, nothing could be more pernicious and criminal. In the wake of the Jacobite rebellion of 1745, Hume is somewhat more guarded in his comments on passive obedience, but the general trend of his thought has not changed. Quoting the Latin tag, Salus populi suprema lex, the safety of the people is the supreme law, Hume argues that since government arises by convention for the purpose of securing the public utility, if obedience to a government should threaten public ruin and thus the destruction of public utility, then that obedience cannot be required. However, as in the treatise, while willing to concede this right to rebellion, Hume is anxious to maintain that such rebellion should be undertaken only in the most extreme of circumstances. Far from its being the case, as some have maintained, that the prospect of rebellion, including tyrannicide if needed, would keep incipient tyrants in check, Hume believes that any such rebellious disposition would in fact increase the likelihood of tyranny and make it, if anything, even more severe. He writes, "Thus, the tyrannicide or assassination approved of by ancient maxims, instead of keeping tyrants and usurpers in awe, made them 10 times more fierce and unrelenting, and is now justly upon that account abolished by the law of nations, and universally condemned as a base and treacherous method of bringing to justice these disturbers of society." On the other hand, Hume chastises those who maintain an exceptionalist doctrine of passive obedience for provoking those who hold a doctrine of the legitimacy of resistance into maintaining such a doctrine. What, in summary, does Hume's account amount to? Well, first, if man's natural mode of existence were asocial, he would be radically unable to satisfy his desires. Moreover, his very existence would be imperiled. Life in society with other human beings is what is required for human flourishing, and indeed for human existence. Society is advantageous for man because cooperation with others both disproportionately enhances man's powers and provides insurance against individual failure. Human beings do not need to be persuaded by rational argument to conjoin with others for their mutual benefit. The natural attraction between the sexes spontaneously gives rise to the basic social unit, the family, and that inevitably leads on to larger forms of social organization. Second, external goods are scarce, and because of that scarcity, our possession of them is unstable. We cannot all have everything, yet there is no obvious reason why Tom, but not Dick or Harriet, should have that particular donkey. Our natural instincts will not guarantee stable possession of external goods, because our untutored concerns are directed first to ourselves, second to our relations and friends, and finally, and most feebly of all, to strangers. This is the point at which reason supplements nature in permitting the emergence of a convention by which stability of possession, in a word property, with its correlative 3 laws of justice, is actually conducive to the enlargement of our interests and those of others. The emergence of the property convention, then, resembles the way in which languages or money come into being. Languages and money emerge spontaneously from common practices, tending towards the promotion of everyone's interests. The conventions of property and justice are so obviously beneficial for all that Hume believes man could not for long have lived in a pre-social condition, if he ever did so at all. How are we to determine what property goes to whom? Why does Tom get the donkey rather than Dick or Harriet? De facto possession is the answer, a de facto possession that transforms into de jure ownership by prescription over time based on reciprocal recognition. Third, what has all this to do with government or with the state? Property is necessary for society, and property requires the observance of rules of justice. Although the long-term interest of all would be served by a strict observance of the laws of justice, some one person may seek his own advantage by their transgression. The solution to this problem is, Hume thinks, to make the observance of justice by everyone the immediate concern of some party. It is given then to someone or to some group to execute the laws of justice and also to settle disputes. These are the basic functions of government. Just as property with its associated rules of justice emerges by convention, so too does government. Once a society develops a robust notion of property, one that requires social stability, together with the possibility of its orderly alienation and a notion of contract, then government is needed to overcome the short-sightedness of individuals. Hume is willing to grant that at the beginning of a government among men there may have been a contract by which men bound themselves to obey, but he points out that once government has been established for some considerable time, we simply suppose ourselves born to submission, and that those who are governors have, by prescription, a right to command, and we a correlative obligation to obey. He writes, "Time and custom give authority to all forms of government, and all successions of princes, and that power, which at first was founded only on injustice and violence, becomes in time legal and obligatory." Men acquiesce in government not because of any contract they have made among themselves or with it, but because they believe that it provides them with security and protection. If Hume is correct, then the question of the justification of the legitimacy of government simply doesn't arise, and no contract or consent or agreement is necessary. Just as we do not need to agree with the rules of English syntax in order for the language to exist and function, so too we do not need to agree that we shall be governed by those who, by prescription, exercise authority over us. There is much that a libertarian can agree with in Hume's account. The spontaneous generation of order, dear to the hearts of libertarians everywhere, is very close to Hume's notion of a convention. It is even possible to read Hume as a supporter of a form of anarchism. He writes, "For Hume, anarchy is a political society rich in conventions, full of cooperative endeavours, well able to provide a suitable environment for peace, prosperity, and individual accomplishment." Libertarians can, I think, agree substantially with Hume's account of the necessity of society for human survival and human flourishing. It is with the last step in Hume's argument that libertarians are likely to demur. Society and government are not the same thing. Society operates on the basis of love or money. People do things for others, either because they love them and disinterestedly desire their welfare, as for example parents do for the most part, or lovers in the first flush of romantic attachment, or they provide services and goods to others in exchange for money. Governments, by contrast, rely for their effects on force and coercion. If society is necessary for human flourishing, it doesn't follow that a coercive government, still less if this particular coercive government, is necessary for society. No society can tolerate the arbitrary initiation of violence against person or property, so laws instantiating the non-aggression principle must be a constituent element of any functioning society. Such laws must be enforceable and enforced. It doesn't follow, however, that there can be only one enforcer of such laws, nor indeed that the enforcer in place at any given time is incontestably entitled to its position. There is a fundamental difficulty with proposing coercive government as the only possible provider of justice and security. Suppose that such a coercive government is instituted to be the protector of property and justice, and that part of its role is to protect us from foreign and domestic threats of violence. But this government now has a monopoly of force. Who or what will protect us against it? Who or what, in John Locke's pregnant phrase, will prevent us being devoured by lions? If the answer to this question is that this government can be trusted to be self-restraining, then, given that any such government is composed ultimately of individuals, the same must be true of individuals in society prior to government. And so the alleged necessity for a single coercive government to be the provider of justice and security is less than compelling. However, if the no justice and security without coercive government problem were in fact genuine, then we cannot rely on voluntary restraint by coercive governments to prevent them abusing their power. And so, logically, we require a super government to restrain them. But, And you can see where this argument is going. Even if we arrive at a one world government, we still have a problem of who or what is going to restrain it. Hume's account, then, is a factually accurate account of people's acquiescence in the political status quo. But just as reason has a role in helping us overcome our self-centred and self-defeating limitations vis-à-vis property and justice, so too reason can call into question the advantages of a coercive government, however prescriptively well established it may be. In fact, Hume's conventionalism can be extended to explain the production and operations of a legal system without coercive government, so that law, like language, morals and money, spontaneously emerges and operates in society.